Great. Good afternoon. What a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me here. To the organizers, to you, Johannes, and I want to go with you through a set of reflections on the ethics of security and surveillance technologies. I haven't really been introduced, but very shortly, I work at the European Commission, where I'm in charge of ethics in science and new technologies, formerly the advisor to the President of the European Commission on these matters. And we've just completed a big chunk of work on the ethics of security and surveillance technologies with the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies. This group is an independent pluralist body advising the European Commission and through it the EU institutions on science and new technologies ethics. It covers a wide set of issues and ranging from nanotechnologies to biotech, classical biomedical issues, but also energy policy, ICT, and indeed security surveillance. Just to give you an overview of how ethics is embedded in the EU institutions. Can you hear me if I do this? It's the afternoon, so we need to be closer together. So the you need the microphone for the camera? Okay. Okay, fun. Right. So this is to give you an overview of the way that ethics is institutionalized in the European Commission. We have the European Group on Ethics I was talking about, which is there, EGE. The Group on Ethics and EU Policies, which is a gathering of different civil servants from the various departments, the various directorates general of the Commission, and the international dialogue that you see on the top there, which brings together the representatives, the chairs, the heads of secretariat of the various national ethics councils from around the world. These in turn relate to further organizations such as the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and others. The boxes that you see there are the different directorates general within the Commission, themselves in close relation with the national ethics councils of the EU member countries. So this is just to give you an idea of the very vast, diverse ecosystem, the very advanced institutionalization of ethics in those different international organizations. Is it easy for you to? Great. And I want to move to the opinion on the ethics of security and surveillance technologies, which was handed over to the President of the Commission a few months ago. You know what? Let me first, before we move on to the next slide, let me first draw your attention to the very innovative and peculiar story that that led to having such an opinion. It is quite daring that the President of the European Commission decided to give that responsibility to this independent body to reflect on these issues. And there is an interesting framing in the topic, in the title of the opinion itself, which is to bring together security and surveillance. This is one of the things that we will have a chance to reflect upon together. Yeah. The structure of this opinion and of the opinions that are usually produced by the European Group on Ethics, well, it starts with a sort of assessment, a stock-taking of the latest technological developments and future trends, then a sort of stock-taking of the governance, the regulatory, the legislative framework, reflecting on the ethical considerations thrown up by these the matter at hand, and then a formulation of a set of policy recommendations. What I want to do with you is to look at those policy recommendations and then to consider together a set of underpinning ethical societal issues to do with what we mean by security, what we mean by surveillance, what are the trade-offs involved in, what is it about this whole narrative of the trade-offs, and then reflect on the role of ethics, such as ethics institutionalized in groups such as these, but also the role of social scientific endeavors, and indeed the role of all of us together in this room. So I'm going to go quite quickly through this just to give you an overview of what the recommendations are. So first of all, a recommendation about accountability of surveillance at EU level and on the part of member states, the importance of a proper system of judicial oversight, the importance also to have independent oversight authorities in the different member states. We can move straight to the next one if you'd agree. Thank you so much. The top point there is about the notion of national security, which is a very interesting loophole in the EU treaties. Basically, there is a requirement of loyalty and of respect of the treaties by all the member states, by all the 28 member states of the European Union. But this requirement is lifted with regard to national security. You got that? And national security can be defined by member states as they see fit. Which means that for some, national security regards activities that can be termed terrorist activities, but other member states view national security as the economic welfare of the country. And so, thinking about it, you realize that this is a pretty big loophole. So one of the key recommendations here is to call for a common agreement on a shared understanding and a shared definition of national security. Recommendation on drone technology, on a comprehensive whistleblowing protection mechanism, personal data, calling for a code of conduct for big data analytics, and then a reflection on algorithms and on the very notion of having certain pieces of software making decisions on the part of humans. Let's move to the next one. Reflection on privacy impact assessment, and also on the twin notions of privacy by design and privacy in design. And reflecting on those, really this idea that the ethical reflexivity that should be exercised by all citizens at all levels can be captured by certain institutional setups, and indeed by certain forms of embedding this ethical reflexivity in technological systems. Yeah, perfect. And then two last points here. One, calling for public awareness of data policies. I don't know if you've had a chance to go through the sessions at this conference. You may have heard that, or you may be well aware, that very few members of the public are aware of the policies in place. We're all thinking about how to optimize the regulatory framework. At the moment, its implementation and its use by the various parties is very poor. And this is really a key issue to be aware of, to draw attention to. And ultimately, a very reflexive recommendation, which is to pursue a thinking process, a collective conversation on how we define security, how we define surveillance, how do we value privacy. And what I'd like for us to do, we have little time together, but let's make the best use of it. So I'd like you to take just a minute and think for yourself, why does security matter to you? If you can just take a minute and think about that question. What's important to you about security? Why does security matter to you? Okay, I'll stop speaking now because I want to let you think.
Thank you very much.
But this is not the end of our time. We're going to let our friends think. We still have 4.5 minutes, and we'll make the best use of those. So, okay?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much for thinking, and I'll be back with you in 35 seconds. Great. Now if you can turn to your neighbor and share with them. So we were very silent, I know. Now they're going to be sort of a buzz. So if you can turn to your neighbor. If you don't have a neighbor, you'll see that if you look far enough, you'll find one. If you're just in between two people, great, it'll be a group of 3. And now if you can think together about this, an exchange. Why is security important to me? Yeah, it's up to you. You get together. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, don't hesitate. Just give them another 30 seconds, and I take 3 minutes to wrap up. We have another 10-15 seconds for you to share the last insight you want with your neighbor. Can you move to the next one? Okay, great. We can get one more. Okay. Thanks. Great, thank you so much. What I'd really want to do is to allow you to share some of those insights with us. However, it's not that we're short of time. It's just that we can't really take that time right now. So we may do it in the conversation that we'll have as Rocco was indicating. Yeah?
We have still 10 minutes from now. No, 8 minutes from now.
Exciting. Wow. Great. So I would just want to ask you if there are, of course, some of these things are private and you don't want to share them with anyone. Others you wanted to share as long as it would remain between you and your neighbor. But maybe there are certain insights that you came up with that you would want to share with all of us. In what way is security important to you? You wanted to go ahead? Sure, yeah. You may need to use the mic. I'm sorry for the, yeah.
I've been the victim of what's called identity theft, a term I actually hate. I could prefer to call it impersonation fraud. Because of that, I became aware of 2 things. One, my own data security processes, even as a researcher in this area, needed to improve. The other was how vulnerable I am to third parties, because so far as I can tell, and without a lot of work, it would be impossible to prove. The actual culprit in this was the UK Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, who issued a fraudulent license. As far as I can tell, all of the at least 3 fraudulent loans taken out in my name were ID'd using that fraudulent license. So that gave me a real personal feeling of what happens when your security is violated.
Thanks. Thank you so much. You wanted to get up? Yeah, sure.
Well, a broader definition of what security means to me, it's you can ensure the quality of life, meaning, first of all, your physical integrity, also guarantees of health, housing, work, and welfare, and that my personal space has enough room to so I can behave freely. That's why security is important to me.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And those two are amazing nuggets. Thank you very much indeed. And I know that there are many more. I just want to draw your attention to not only the vast diversity of meanings that security can have as such, not only the very personal dimension, you know, the way that each and every one of us relates in a very personal way because of lived experience, because of knowledge as well, academic accumulated knowledge as well, to this notion. It means different things to different people. And what do we mean by security? It's interesting to reflect also on what we have been meaning by security, which you may call the etymology of the notion of security, or the history of thought version of what security means. Similarly for surveillance, and I'm not going to go through this, but it's important really to realize that surveillance has its emergence is timed, is really marked by the context of the post-French Revolution setting in which it emerged. And in this etymological, socio-historical cradle of emergence, you see the connection between public authority, between, let's say, public-private, between notions of trade-off between security and freedom already at work. Similarly for security and its emergence in Greek thought with the notion of sinecura, of without care or worry-free, the tension between internal and external security, the tension between the notion of security as something that we can work on inside of us and as something that is materialized as an external threat is already very present. And these are tensions, notions that we've been carrying with us up until today. Now, very briefly on the notion of trade-offs, and I say very briefly with great peace of mind, because I know that many of the friends and colleagues here on the panel will continue reflecting on trade-offs, and so will we together. There too, really looking at the prevalence of this framing of security positioned as a trade-off with privacy, with freedoms. You know the famous Obama quote, we can't have 100% security and we can't have 100% privacy, so we're going to have to choose, with the very notion that you're giving away some of your freedoms in order to gain security, which there too has to be interrogated. What are we trading? What are the terms of the trade? How can we evaluate what is lost and what is gained? And what are the distributional dimensions of this? Who is giving away what and who is gaining? Is it the same we? Is it the same we who can't have 100% security and the same we who's giving away their privacy? And then we have something to, we're out of time, but we have this thing to keep on thinking about. The role of ethics, the role that we play. The same way that by confiscating ethical reflexivity and placing it in technologies with privacy by design, we're gaining some privacy, but we're losing on the critical edge, on the critical reflexivity that we should all be exercising. Could it be that by entrusting certain institutions, certain bodies, or certain people, I think most of us here, with this thinking, we may be losing out in more broader societal terms. So I leave you with that thought. I'm very happy to take questions of clarification to continue the conversation afterward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jim, especially for proving me right that it's still full of surprises conference. Please shoot your question. First round now. Short question, please. Not big political statement.
Michael, do you deal with the presentation? Oh. Could you come back to the first slide? Okay, yeah, okay. So I'm Sara Degli Esposti. I'm presenting the results of the Surprise project. And before I start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the story of this project. It's called Surprise because everything started 4 years ago when we analyzed, my co-author and I, worked on data coming from the PRISMS project. And what we realized by analyzing those data was that the assumption related to the privacy security trade-off probably were not completely accurate. And so we started trying to dig into this idea, which is an assumption usually taken, that people, when they face the introduction of a new security technology, they will be willing to give up part of their privacy for better security. This kind of discourse has been used a lot, especially in the political arena, but the theoretical assumptions on which it is based have never been empirically investigated. And this is why we decided to propose this Surprise project. The Surprise project has been a 3-year project funded by the European Commission. Can we move on? What we did was to organize citizen summits in 9 countries in the European Union. You can see here the different countries. And in order to make the topic more specific, we selected 3 specific surveillance-oriented security technologies, which in brief we call SOST. And these were smart CCTV, deep act inspection, and smartphone location tracking. So what we did was to, in each country, gather together in one day about 200 citizens and ask them questions about their privacy and security preferences in general, and also specific questions about each of these technologies. What we wanted to understand is, was what are the factors which influence people at the time of deciding whether or not they are going to support the introduction of a new surveillance-based security measure. We we created this definition because surprise means the relationship between 3 main ideas, which are surveillance, privacy, and security. And we try to disentangle surveillance from security. I know that from, for example, a criminological perspective, this sounds quite weird. I mean, you really need surveillance in order to achieve a security goal. But we have tried to challenge this idea and say, you know what? Actually, privacy and security are both values, and they both contribute to the freedom of people. So we don't see a conflict between these two. And so we came with this idea that probably the problem is surveillance and the use made of surveillance in deploying both the technology and the procedure. Can we go on? So what I'm showing here, well, I know it looks quite messy, but these are the main factors we identified which play a role in shaping public acceptability of surveillance-based security measures. The most important factors are effectiveness. I mean, people, when they assess a new security solution, they really think, is this gonna solve the problem? Is that accurate? Is that effective? And Also, another very relevant characteristic is whether or not the technology is going to be used as part of a blanket surveillance strategy or is targeting just criminals. The variable you see, targeted surveillance, the technical term we call it is social proximity, but what it means is that technologies which are developed, designed, conceived in a way that target a specific crime or is meant to solve a specific security problem are considered to be far more acceptable than other solutions which just adopt a blanket surveillance approach. And of course, the fact that the technology is perceived to be intrusive, is perceived to be risky in terms of the chance of producing embarrassment, on making people feel self-conscious, it's a factor which play against the acceptability of these measurements. The fourth most important factor is institutional trustworthiness. What does it mean? It's not just about the technology. People perfectly understand that the device as such can be very well designed, very well developed, but is going to work anyway in a certain institutional and cultural context. And so what they say is that it's extremely important that the security agencies managing the system are trustworthy, which means that they are capable of what they do. They do not use their powers against the public, and they really care about the well-being of people. So, and these are the factors, and the numbers indicate the specific hypothesis we tested. And I'm not gonna go into the detail, but we mainly ran two models, one using structure equation modeling, and the others using a non-parametric technique called quantile regression. And we found robust results across all three SOST. These are the lines you see here. So what else? There are other aspects. The other thing I'm forgetting to mention is privacy, of course. The more people are concerned about their privacy, the less willing they are to accept the new surveillance-based security measure. And if we look into what is behind people's concerns for their privacy, for example, you can see that, for example, people who understand more how the technology works are the more concerned ones, because they know the risks. And also, the fact that the technology may produce some future risks, there could be some bad consequences in the future, play also a role against the acceptability of the solution. And finally, the fact that the solution is implemented close to the reality, close to the physical place where the person lives, also play a role, because it increases people's privacy concerns, because they perceive that this solution is going to intrude into their lives. Other factors we investigated are the perceived level of threat. This is a very important factor coming from the security study literature. If people are highly concerned for their personal safety, they are more willing to accept a new security measure. What we found is that if people do not have previous knowledge on the matter, their assessment of their personal safety, yes, do play a role, but does play a role, sorry. But if these people have the chance to think twice about the issue, like happened in our participatory exercises, these factors stopped playing a role, because there are other things which become more important. And another idea, which is quite common, I mean, usually people think young people don't care much about their privacy, young people tend to accept almost anything. Well, we actually found the contrary. Young people are the ones more willing to oppose the introduction of these surveillance-based security measures. And regarding the trade-off, we tested the hypothesis whether or not people who use the trade-off approach to assess the technology are more or less willing to accept the technology. And we found support for this hypothesis only in the case of DPI. We didn't find support in the other two cases, in the case of smart CCTV and smartphone location tracking. So at this stage, we can only speculate why the trade-off discourse works in the case of DPI and it doesn't work in other cases. And of course, this is the final factor, people who are very in favor of the use of technology to solve any kind of problem, especially in this case security problems, they are more in favor of in general of using surveillance-based security measures because of their positive attitude toward technology. Can we move on? Okay, and this is just to sum up. And so acceptable cost must be accurate and effective, managed by capable and honest security agents, clearly targeted toward criminals, and should avoid to be intrusive and expose people to the risks of feeling embarrassed or to expose people to future risks or to raise substantial privacy concerns. Let's move on. And finally, what I'm showing here is the support that each security measure received from our results. So as you can see, smart CCTV was the measure which was considered by the participants to the Citizen Summit as being not very intrusive and useful. So which means that actually we found quite a high level of support for this kind of measure. While in contrast, if you look at deep act inspection, you can see that deep act inspection was considered to be a measure highly intrusive, still useful. In the case of smartphone location tracking, the measure was considered to be highly intrusive and useful, as in the previous case. Still, many people consider it useful and not intrusive. So it's like halfway through between the other two cases. So I think I can conclude. A acceptable security measure must demonstrate to be able to foster public safety, both in objective and in subjective terms. This is what we're trying to achieve, to reconcile public authorities with the public, in the sense that public security agencies are not there to do something against the citizens. I mean, they are supposed to be there to protect the citizens. And what has happened has been this gap, the creation of this big gap between these authorities and the final users of their services. And what we have tried to, as part of the project, through a number of recommendations we have produced, has been an attempt to help security agencies to come back and understand what the public really wants. And trustworthiness, just as a final remark, is key. It's really key to ensure that people really feel safe and secure. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I think it was, thank you so much, because it was really so interesting. I have several questions, but I just want to keep it to questions of clarification at this stage, or something rather short. Just two small things. How come, or what was the methodology, or what are your hypotheses in terms of explaining why the perceived level of threat as a determinant of people's reaction played a lessened role once people had a chance to think twice about it? So you explained that, you know, at first it played a high role, but after some form of conversation or you know, deeper thought process, the role lessened. And then on the trade-off hypothesis, you said that for deep packet inspection, it had played, I mean, it seemed more convincing. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and what could be the explanations?
Okay. Well, starting from the trade-off. What's going on is that, at least at this stage, what we think is that when people face a very an highly controversial technology, like in the case of deep packet inspection, I mean, the case of deep packet inspection, we also gather qualitative data as part of the project. So we also get insights from the discussion that people were having during the events. And people were seriously concerned about the fact that they were all using the internet and they had no idea about deep packet inspection. So they were surprised, they felt not in control, they felt they really had no power against these measurements. But on the other side, they also saw the importance of using, the effectiveness of using this measure, particularly for tackling very serious security issues, and like pedophilia, for example. Well, during the Citizen Summit, at the beginning of the event, of each session, we show a short documentary film explaining the technology and trying to also present the advantages and disadvantages from different point of view. And regarding the other question on the level of threat, this has been demonstrated in previous studies, especially from the US, coming from the US. People are highly concerned about their security in the aftermath, for example, of a big security accident, like, for example, a terrorist attack. And so at that stage, but this effect declines over time. So which means that in the hours, in the days, immediately after the event, people are willing to accept almost anything, just because they're extremely concerned. And so politicians, for example, can manipulate the public opinion on the basis of of what's going on. But over time, when things calm down and people have the time to think twice about it, other considerations, like consideration related to civil liberties, human rights, emerge again. And this is how it works. We just we got some scientific evidence now to make this point. Thank you.
I have my second question, but I think it would be better to go to Michael, and I will give my question for Michael. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Rocco. I've been the coordinator of PRISM, Privacy and Security Mirrors, which is one of the other projects dealing with the same research question as surprise. And the short version of my term is we had the same goal, we had different methodology, and, well, almost the same results. Thank you. But I've prepared a couple of slides to substantiate this claim.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So, needless to say, we are also interested in the factors influencing how the public assessment of security and privacy implications of security technologies are constituted, and we are also questioning the privacy security trade-off. And we've done that in contrast to surprise by a big pan-European representative survey. the theory behind that is a theory of planned behavior, distinguishing on the one hand values very deeply, but then an attitude towards a certain behavior or value, in this case towards security and privacy. And you have to distinguish that this attitude is something different than the attitudes towards a concrete practice or intention to behave or the behavior itself. And this is, well, the simple explanation for the so-called privacy paradox. And well, it's not a paradox, it can be explained scientifically. But we have also tried to prove that with our questionnaire. So we had a section on general attitudes to make this trade-off test. But we were also addressing questions towards specific contexts to contextualize these attitudes and test to what extent they may influence behavior or intention to behave. And as Jim nicely outlined, security means a lot of things to people, and there are also lots of technologies out there addressing these different kinds of securities. And furthermore, to give people an impression, like in the documentary films in Surprise, we developed so-called vignettes, which are very, very tiny scenarios, descriptions of settings in which security technology is implemented and is affecting human rights. And of course, we have also some questions about demographics. So, what did we do? Pan-European survey, a couple of numbers, 27 countries, all in all 27,000 interviews. We were in the field from February to June next year, and we had interviews of some 30 minutes duration. So that was really an extensive exercise. I'm not going to report extensively about the trade-offs test. Briefly and maybe not surprising, that both privacy and security are important to people at the attitudes level, as you could read from many, many surveys before, that there is no significant relationship between in citizens between the attitudes during these two constructs. And we have even made the distinction between my personal security and, well, the security of the country, of the region I live in, which already makes a big difference. So, but of course, things are not that easy to say, well, it has nothing to do and we should aim to have both of them. Because in concrete cases, well, of course, the rules of the game change for several reasons. First one I've already mentioned, general attitudes are not intentions to behave. Second one is there are, of course, other factors that play a role in a specific situation. And then in the individual itself, there is bounded rationality and compromises that have to be made, which are based, again, then on other factors, values, and so forth, that have to be taken into account. Okay, as I said, we were dealing with that kind of question with a number of 8 different vignettes. We aimed to cover, well, the area of possible security issues, technologies that's currently out there. We had kind of a mapping, privately operated security systems publicly, ones that are purely virtual in the internet, other ones that are more physical. And for the rest of the presentation, when I'm presenting more concrete numbers, apart from the next slide, I will deal with one in the physical public side, or the police crowd surveillance stuff that is a little bit related to your smart surveillance exercise in Surprise. So I'm not going to read that. Just to give you an impression how these vignettes, these micro scenarios look like. In the case of crowd surveillance, we even made another distinction, saying In the first case, it's a member of an environmental group going to a demonstration against a nuclear plant, and the police is surveilling them. And the other one, it's a football fan going to a match, and well, the match is surveyed in the same way as the demonstration in the other case, which makes a difference. So, I'm just for the last time, I'm showing you the whole breadth of vignettes that we have, and will show you the numbers. And as you can see from these bars, I'm not going to go into detail. There are big differences. Well, security and privacy perceptions are very context dependent. Things like NSA type surveillance is very negatively connotated, while things like APNR cameras, crowd surveillance in the football stadium are very positive. For the same reason that Sara already mentioned before, and I will come back to that later on. So, this is a little bit different, difficult, but it's the only type of statistical analysis, or the outcome of statistical analysis that I'm going to show. We were wondering if these differences exist, what are the factors that really are the reasons for the differences, and that can give you an impression of what's happening. So there you have the 8 vignettes that we have tested. On the other, in the other ones, you have a selection of factors that we have taken into account. And as you can see, all the red cells are significant, which means they have an influence. There is no indication if it is a positive, a supporting influence, or a negative one, if it's a strong or a weak one. It's just showing there is an influence. So not surprisingly, the privacy attitudes and the security attitudes play a role. That was to be expected. It would have been a surprise if it had been differently. Also, countries make a difference, which is maybe not surprising as well after what Sara said about certain things which are related to the infrastructures of the different European countries. And then there is a number of intra-individual factors, such as privacy activism. Is someone more active in protecting his privacy? Privacy invasion stands for the experience a person has. Did he really experience an invasion of his privacy already? Is there a trust in institutions? Age, gender, and so forth. And it's very mixed. There is no clear picture of these individual factors that would have an influence in each and every of these vignettes. And we are constructing kind of a structural model, as Sara has presented here as well, but we're not that far, so I cannot present it. Instead, maybe I can show you a little bit from the data from the survey how these differences how they show up. So same practices, different context makes a difference. As I already said, we had the same scenario for the demonstration and the football match, and of course, for us it was not surprising that in case of a football match, people were much more positive about being surveyed than in the case of a demonstration, which obviously had to do with different human rights, civil rights being influenced in these cases. Nothing is without alternatives, though German policymakers sometimes stated that in the last years. It is quite interesting that even in cases where citizens are rather positive about security surveillance practices, as in the case of these crowd surveillance stuff, as you can see here, there's a lot of people saying participants should expect to be monitored, which is echoing the rather positive assessment, there is, well, a majority of people who say, well, there are methods for the same goals that exist that might maybe be better suited than the ones based on technology, on surveillance technologies. And we often asked for low-tech solutions, policemen in stadiums, or leave surveillance at all, things like that. So people are aware of alternatives, and they are positive about alternatives due to, well, questions of effectiveness, as Sara also mentioned. Trust in institutions. There are a couple of other influencing factors, and one of the strongest influencing factors is to what extent people trust in their institutions, and this is something that which has to do with regional differences throughout Europe. Even in this rather simple example, there are, well, quite some significant differences in countries. Well, you cannot read that. That, for instance, in Greece, Lilian will say something about the special situation of Greece in the next panel. Austria and Germany are especially skeptical about surveillance, even in these rather uncritical situations. Romania, Italy being more positive about that. And even for the most uncritical one, the football match situation, there are, well, at least some differences in place. So let me conclude. For this one situation that I've presented, the football, and in particular the football stadium scenario, crowd surveillance, and it's about the same for ANPR, automatic number plate recognition for speeding, is rather acceptable to citizens, because, as in the case of surprise, people tend to accept security practices that they do understand, that address security issues that they consider severe or serious, and that affects them. Trust in institution is a crucial factor. That's maybe even on top of all that, most important one. We see a high influence of education. The more educated people are, the more concern they have. So knowledge makes suspicious. Gender has, well, virtually no influence. Only in a few cases it is significant. It's very difficult to explain. Age is significant, and as also Sara outlined, the younger adults are not necessarily less interested in privacy. They do not value privacy less than older ones. And it certainly has to do with specific phases in life as well. So it's significant in some cases, and there might be some explanations based on age. The distinction between rural and urban areas, you could say, well, urban areas are less secure. Obviously not. We did not see any significant influence on that one. Same for work sites, practically no influence. And there is, well, some weak influence of political attitude, only in some of the cases that I've not presented here. It has some influence. All interim results, as I said, we are trying to put that all into a structural model, and we hope to be there in about 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Only if there are
Michael, I'm just curious as to whether you asked specific questions about these scenarios for individual differences. So I was thinking of the AMPR, for instance. Did you ask whether people were drivers or non-drivers, and whether people were football fans or not football fans in the crowd monitoring? Did you try and put those in each of these scenarios, or did you not put that in?
That was something that was on our wish list, but economically it was not possible to get that kind of information as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Sara, please.
Sure, thank you. It's a real privilege to be here, especially with such great company. My name is Sara St. Vincent. I am the Human Rights and Surveillance Legal Fellow at an NGO called the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is based in Washington, D.C., although we also have an office here in Brussels. And I'm going to talk a little bit about U.S. citizens' perceptions of surveillance, and then a bit about how, oh no, I don't, thank you. A bit about how I think this idea of a trade-off also affects those of us in civil society and who do human rights work. But I should start at the outset by saying that CDT, unlike my colleagues here, we don't do original research in this area. We do a lot of kind of legal work, policy work. So what I'm about to tell you is largely based on public information, although I'll delve a bit into some kind of European legal issues that I hope you'll find interesting. So just to get us started, and in talking about the U.S., it's not that I assume that you think the U.S. is inherently interesting, but I think that, obviously our surveillance programs, including our surveillance of ourselves, have been a bit more fully ventilated lately than others, and so I think in some ways U.S. citizens' views are especially interesting. So in the U.S., the limited polling data we have suggests that citizens are pretty split or ambivalent about this kind of idea of a trade-off between privacy and security, or about NSA surveillance in general. There is research suggesting that there has been a shift over time in that people were more approving of NSA surveillance at the time of the Snowden revelations or immediately afterward, and perceptions of NSA surveillance have understandably become a bit more negative. But having said that, the split is still fairly even. The most recent numbers I saw from the middle of last year suggested that it's about 49% against and 47% who approve basically of what the NSA does. I've also seen some very interesting polling data that suggests that people are concerned, but that it's pretty low down on the hierarchy of concerns. So there was a poll done that suggested that people seem to be more worried about issues that have a kind of tangible, palpable, immediate effect. So things like crime, the economy is the biggest one, medical care, education, things like that. There is a great deal of concern about surveillance. It's just fairly low down on the list, which I think suggests to me as a member of the NGO community that perhaps we haven't done an especially great job maybe of really driving home the impact of surveillance and what it really means, and that it does have a tangible effect on people's lives that they ought to be thinking about. And it is, it's one of the biggest, most systemic human rights violations of our day, and the people ought to be more concerned about it. There was a poll from just last week that posited this trade-off situation. To what extent would you give up your privacy in order for the government to be able to investigate terrorism? And an overwhelming majority of people in the US who were polled said they would prefer for the government to investigate terrorism, even at the expense of privacy, which I think is not necessarily a huge surprise in terms of the way the question was framed. So this brings me to my first overarching point, which I think is one reason we need studies like this, and I wish we had them in the US, and maybe they're ongoing and I just don't know about them, is that I think we need to ask people about privacy and surveillance in a way that A, decouples those two things and so measures attitudes separately, as I know that you have been doing, and that complicates that trade-off a bit, that explores kind of the nuances, the different aspects of privacy, different types of surveillance. But even beyond that, I wonder if US persons' responses would be a bit different if we posited a different trade-off. So in the US, privacy is not traditionally held to be this kind of really core civil right in the way that in the European system, for example, in EU law or the European Convention on Human Rights, or if you look at the international human rights treaties, privacy is in there and it's a really, really core right. In the US, we give that kind of sacred status to freedom of expression. I think for us, it's much easier to view that as an almost absolute right that no one should tread upon. And so I wonder if we frame the question not as a trade-off between privacy and security, if we framed it as a trade-off between freedom of expression and security, because we know that surveillance does have a chilling effect on freedom of expression. We know it affects freedom of expression in a variety of ways. And so I wonder if these polling results would be different if this trade-off were framed a little bit differently. And I think that that could really be interesting to explore, as I said, just because of the cultural values in play. I think also in the US, there's a pretty widespread failure. I mean, I think the media have sort of embraced this idea of a trade-off, or embraced the idea of a balance, and I think, you know, some of the polling questions themselves do that. There's been a widespread failure to challenge the idea, I mean, a kind of threefold failure. First, to challenge the idea that surveillance is effective. Second, to challenge the idea that more surveillance is more effective. And third, to really push ourselves to think about whether more surveillance is more effective in preventing the worst kinds of terrorism or public violence. We really could stand to look into these things a little bit more. And I think it's so again, we don't do original research in this area, but just kind of speaking anecdotally, I think we shouldn't underestimate the sense of kind of futility or fatalism that may account for some of the answers that people give when they're polled. In the sense that there's a poll from November of last year where people said they feel an overwhelming sense of lack of control over their own data. Now that was sort of expressed in the consumer privacy context, but you can imagine, I'm sure it applies to government surveillance as well. And especially in a context where we have really, really struggled to hold anyone to account for abusive surveillance. The NSA, various other intelligence agencies that carry this out, private contractors. So in a climate where the powers that be who conduct this surveillance operate with such impunity, and where it's so difficult to hold them to account, and where it's so difficult to find out more information about what they're doing, I wonder if people just sort of resign themselves, and since they think they can't change it, they just learn to accept it. So again, sort of challenge for the NGO community. And then moving on to my kind of second overarching point, I think we in civil society ourselves tend to get dragged into the trade-off framework. We kind of get, if you like, suckered into having the argument in those terms. And I think one way that we need to make sure that we don't kind of accept this trade-off inadvertently. And we also need to make sure that courts don't accept it either, because it is very tempting. And one area where I think maybe this slide might tend to happen is when we talk about proportionality. And some of you, raise your hand if you've heard of the 13 principles or the necessity and proportionality principles. Anybody? 13? Yeah, 13 principles? No, a couple of people. So it's a set of principles that NGOs in the US have put out that I think it's actually gone global, that we think all government surveillance in all areas of the world ought to adhere to. And proportionality is really a key one, and CDT supports that, and I support that. So it's not that proportionality is inherently a bad idea. And I think that the principles, if you look at them, they help to show that proportionality isn't necessarily a zero-sum game. It's not necessarily kind of, you know, tied in that way. And it's also, I think, worth mentioning that, believe me, proportionality, to get the US government to admit to proportionality as a desirable principle in the area of surveillance would be a huge step forward. There have been fights at the General Assembly about that in terms of the new resolution on the right to privacy in the digital age, where proportionality language was in there, and then it wasn't because, as we've heard, the Five Eyes didn't want it there. But, so we in the NGO community really tend to bang on about, you know, proportionality and wanting this to be considered. And obviously, it's something that the European Court of Human Rights has started to embrace in its jurisprudence as well. But the point I'd like to raise is that that idea isn't in the treaties. When you look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it talks about lawfulness and non-arbitrariness in terms of surveillance being acceptable under human rights. When you look at the European Convention on Human Rights, the standards are in accordance with the law and necessary in a democratic society for certain specific purposes. And when the European Court of Human Rights first started addressing surveillance in the early 1970s, there was this very influential early case against Germany, where the German government argued in favor of a certain version of the proportionality principle. The German government said, the greater the threat, the more surveillance we should be able to do. And the court didn't bite. They didn't go for it. And instead what they said was, and I want to make sure I get this right, powers of secret surveillance of citizens, characterizing as they do the police state, are tolerable under the convention only insofar as strictly necessary for safeguarding of the democratic institutions. And I want to repeat that again, strictly necessary for safeguarding of the democratic institutions. And it wasn't until at least a few years later that the term proportionality starts cropping up in the court's analysis. And I think the court still hasn't given us a really clear idea of what they mean by proportionality. But I think that we would be right to think in the way that that court did back in the early 1970s and resist this idea that the greater the threat, the more surveillance the government is entitled to do. And I would like for maybe all of us to think about, I mean, obviously necessity and proportionality are related ideas, but to me, strictly necessary for safeguarding democratic institutions sounds awfully strict. In fact, when I first put this in a paper, my boss thought it was totally radical until I told him that it was actually the court that had said it. And they've repeated it. They repeated it in 2000. The Grand Chamber did. They repeated it actually last week in a case against Croatia. So it's not crazy. And I think that we could stand to really think about it and unpack it a bit. And I think that if we did, maybe it would help to keep us from being dragged off into this kind of relativism, or maybe the kind of balancing of the scales that the term proportionality might suggest if you don't really have a firm understanding of what else it could mean. And the last thing I'll say is that one thing that should really frighten us, I think, is that these days, the European Court of Human Rights, so when it does an analysis of secret surveillance programs carried out by governments, it takes those bits of Article 8 in order. It analyzes whether it's in accordance with the law, and then whether it's necessary in a democratic society. And these days, very often, it doesn't even get to that necessity proportionality analysis, because it winds up finding that the kinds of secret surveillance that's carried out in Europe is basically illegal under the domestic laws of the countries where it's carried out. It doesn't have an adequate basis in public statutory law. And so we ought to really, I think we ought to think about how frightening that is if we have that many cases reaching Strasbourg where the surveillance we're looking at, we don't even get to a balancing test. We don't even get to a trade-off analysis because it's just flatly illegal in the countries where it's carried out. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. I give the floor to Jakob, and I open also the floor for everybody else.
Okay, I think first, if there are any questions to Sara, we could take them while I prepared some questions, because this session is also about the answers we get from citizens when we ask them. And I like to ask you some of the same questions that we asked the citizens before actually revealing how the citizens answered. Now, Sara did, from the Surprise Project, did tell us a bit about that, but if we, if we, for instance, think a little bit about questions like, and now I know all of you are experts in the area, but if you also think a little bit about your role as a normal citizen in our society, how important do you think your own control of your data is? And we asked the citizens this question, and if you were to think about it and then answer. Now, of course, in our citizen summits, we did it a bit more refined, and the method was a bit more strict. But if you were to raise your hand, if you say this is very important to you, please do that now. If you think your control of your own data is very important, please raise your arm high, if you mean that. Okay, and if you think it's important, and if you don't think it's important. Okay, if we, yeah, please. If you're actually completely in tune with the citizens throughout Europe. If you combine the two darker blue ones, you can see the numbers speak for itself. The control of data is, of course, extremely important in our survey. Please, the next one. And how concerned are you, if you are concerned, that the use of this, we remember it from Sara's talk, this is security-oriented surveillance technologies, that they are eroding your privacy. If you are very concerned, please raise your hand. Okay, this is, you cannot see it as well. I would say around 80%. If you are concerned, if you are not really concerned. Okay, let's see the results. This is a little different. Then you're a bit more concerned than the average citizens when you ask these types of questions. Sorry? Yes, of course. But remember, the first one you are actually quite in line. Yeah. The next one, please. This is specifically on deep packet inspections because we did ask on all technologies. But does the use of deep packet inspection improve the national security and your personal feeling of security? And this is quite in line with what the poll in the US just asked, actually. But if you were to answer this, then there was the possibility to say surely yes, probably yes, and no, and not at all. No, sorry, probably not. Yes, thank you. If you mean surely yes, DPI will improve national security and your feeling of. I realize these are two questions. Then please raise your hand. Anyone dare to? not in this room. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Context is extremely important. We were not asking questions in this rude manner. We were actually having people discussing these questions, and we wrote down the rationale. Now you're just getting the very brief. But would anyone say that it improved some national security? Yeah. Okay, and not at all. So there's a lot of, I don't know, maybe. Okay, let's. This is these represents tables. How many tables would suggest that at each meeting? So the citizens were kind of a bit on both sides in this question. It wasn't in itself clear, and this points to that we need to actually go into the deliberation, read the arguments, the rationale, in order to analyze this kind of data. The next one, please. Would you regard DPI as intrusive to privacy? Please raise your hand if you say surely yes. Okay, and perhaps yes, and not at all. Okay. You quite agree with the citizens. So we are actually looking at now that it can be both effective, as Sara was pointing out in her presentation, but it can also be intrusive to privacy. This is the same result, of course, but this is from the small scale meeting. I can go into the detail in the next panel, but this is we know more about how people think in the smaller session. And the last one, please. This was very important for us as well, because now we talk about a technology like DPI, and we get this result that it's effective and intrusive. And what does that really mean? It's kind of difficult to grasp that. But when we ask people to look for alternatives, now this is, I'm not going to ask you to vote on this, because we have 5 results here. We have from all the technologies that we work with. That's biometrics, CCTV cameras, it's smartphone location tracking, it's drones, and it's deep packet inspection. And you think a bit about what technology do you think they thought it was most important to find alternative to, and what technology were the least important to find alternative to of these 5? Let's look at the result. Drones. Yeah, that's correct. How did you guess that?
Well, I know. Well, okay, sorry. Yeah. No, I mean, I have the China plans to have a drone overlooking each
Yes, and also I suppose it's a newer technology where you see CCTV cameras. Oh, you cannot read it. Sorry, it's down here. So this is CCTV where you can actually see that most tables they don't necessarily want politicians to look for alternatives, whereas drones is the clearest. But all of the technologies you'll find in high priority, and it should be prioritized. That's 4 tables out of 5. So the vast majority in all these instances says go find alternatives. So no matter if they find it effective, they still want politicians to look for alternatives.